July, 1488. While the Tudor dynasty was still washing the blood of the War of the Roses from its hands, a child was born in a cave in Knaresborough. She was born into a storm that locals claimed was conjured by the devil himself, deformed, abandoned by society, and branded a monster before she could speak. Ursula Southeil would not only survive, she would see the Great Fire of London, the fall of kings, and the end of empires. Today, we peel back the layers of Victorian lies and Tudor terror to find the woman behind the myth. Welcome to the archive. This is the truth of Mother Shipton. To understand the prophecy, one must first understand the isolation. Knaresborough, Yorkshire, in the late 15th century was a place of deep shadows and even deeper superstitions. This was an era where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was as thin as a shroud. The story begins with Agatha Southeil, a 15-year-old girl with no family, no status, and most dangerously for the time, no explanation for the child growing within her. When Agatha refused to name the father, the town didn't see a victim. They saw a vessel for the profane. In 1488, social exclusion was a death sentence. Agatha was driven from the village, finding refuge in a limestone cavern on the banks of the river Nidd. It was here, amidst the smell of damp earth and sulfur, that Ursula Southeil entered the world. Legend dictates that her birth was accompanied by a thunderclap so violent, it shook the foundations of the nearby castle. But the true horror, according to contemporary accounts, was Ursula herself. She was described as having a long, crooked nose, eyes that glowed like embers, and limbs that seemed twisted by a cruel hand. In the vocabulary of the 15th century, physical deformity was a direct reflection of a deformed soul. She was the devil's bastard before she had even taken her first breath. But the cave offered more than just shelter, it offered an omen. Adjacent to Ursula's birthplace lies the Petrifying Well. To the modern geologist, it is a fascinating display of mineral-rich waters, calcium carbonate and magnesium turning everyday objects into stone over months of saturation. But to a Tudor peasant, watching a bird or a glove turn to solid rock in a matter of weeks was nothing short of black magic. The water was cursed, and by extension so was the child born beside it. Ursula spent her first 2 years in that cave. Think of the psychological blueprint that creates. While other children were learning to speak in the warmth of a hearth, Ursula was listening to the rhythmic dripping of mineral water and the whispers of the Yorkshire wind. She was raised in the literal bedrock of the earth. When the local magistrates eventually intervened, removing Ursula to a foster home and sending Agatha to a convent, the damage or the transformation was complete. Ursula was a child of the stone. She grew up in a village that looked at her with a mixture of pity and visceral fear. She was the hag of the Nidd, a girl who lived on the periphery of humanity. In this first block of her life, we see the formation of the oracle. Prophecy is rarely born from a place of comfort. It is born from the outside looking in. Because Ursula was denied a place in the social order of Knaresborough, she was forced to observe the patterns of that world from a distance. She saw the hypocrisy of the clergy, the greed of the merchants, and the fragility of the crown. By the time she reached her teenage years, the rumors began to shift. It wasn't just that she looked like a witch, it was that things happened around her. Objects moved, the weather changed, and most importantly, she began to speak of things that hadn't happened yet. She didn't speak as a fortune teller looking for coin. She spoke as a witness to a future that was already to her, an established fact. As we move forward, we will look at how this monster of the cave did the impossible. She found a place in the world, and she began to dismantle the certainties of the Tudor court with a single rhyming breath. The year was 1512. England was a volatile tapestry of religious fervor and burgeoning Renaissance thought. Yet in the north, the medieval mind still held a suffocating grip on reality. It was in this climate that Ursula Southeil did something that defied every social expectation of the era. She married Tudor Sibyl, a local carpenter and a man of some standing in the community, took the hag of the Nidd as his wife. To the onlookers in Knaresborough, this union was incomprehensible. Rumors flew that Ursula had used a love potion, or worse, that she had ensnared him through a glamour spun from the mineral-heavy mists of her birth cave. But the reality, though less supernatural, was perhaps more profound. Ursula had moved from the literal periphery of a damp limestone cavern into the heart of a domestic structure. Yet, the cave never truly left her. She did not become a traditional housewife of the Tudor age. While other women tended to the hearth and the loom, Ursula's garden became a laboratory of the uncanny. She was a master of herbalism, a skill that sat on a razor's edge during the reign of Henry VIII. In one hand, she held the knowledge of healing, the properties of nightshade, foxglove, and elderberry, and in the other she held the terrifying power of the sight. In the 16th century, the line between a cunning woman and a witch was drawn with the blood of the accused. Ursula walked that line with a chilling confidence. She began to provide counsel, not just on the ailments of the flesh, but on the anxieties of the soul and the mysteries of the future. Her reputation began to spread like a slow-moving fog across the Yorkshire moors. It wasn't just the local peasants who sought her out. The whispers of her accuracy reached the ears of the gentry and the nobility. She was no longer just the deformed girl from the cave. She was Mother Shipton, a title of respect born out of a deep, visceral fear. Her speech remained cryptic, often delivered in rhyming couplets that seemed to bypass the conscious mind and strike directly at the primal fears of her listeners. She spoke of a world that would eventually turn upside down, of carriages that would move without horses, and of thoughts that would fly around the world in the blink of an eye. While some of these specific technological prophecies were later embellished or outright fabricated by Victorian opportunists, the core of her contemporary fame was built on something much more immediate: the downfall of the powerful. The most defining moment of this period, and perhaps the one that cemented her legend in the annals of English history, was her confrontation with Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was the most powerful man in England, the king's shadow, a man whose ambition was as vast as his red robes. When it was announced that Wolsey intended to move his court to York, a city he had been appointed Archbishop of but had never actually visited, Mother Shipton made a public declaration that silenced the marketplace. He shall see York, but never shall he set foot within its walls. This was not merely a prediction. In the context of Tudor politics, it was a death sentence or an act of treason. When the cardinal heard of this, he did not laugh. He sent 3 of his most trusted men, Lord Percy, Lord Darcy, and Sir Magnus, to silence the witch. They arrived at her cottage not with the intent to listen, but to intimidate. They found a woman who did not tremble. According to the accounts passed down through the centuries, she welcomed them not as masters but as messengers of an inevitable fate. Sir Magnus, a man known for his cruelty, challenged her, demanding to know what would become of him. Ursula looked at him and simply stated that he would eventually be hanged from the highest point of his own ambition. As Wolsey's party approached York, they stopped at Cawood Castle, just a few miles from the city gates. From the towers of Cawood, the cardinal could clearly see the spires of the York Minster gleaming in the distance. He had reached his goal. He sent word back to the village, mocking the prophetess, claiming her vision had failed. But even as the messengers rode out, the king's men were arriving at Cawood with a warrant for Wolsey's arrest on the charge of high treason. Wolsey was forced to turn back toward London, never entering the city he had seen from the battlements. He died in Leicester before he could face the king's wrath. This event transformed Mother Shipton from a local curiosity into a national omen. She had dared to point a finger at the highest echelons of the Catholic Church and the Tudor state, and the universe had seemed to align with her words. She became a symbol of the vox populi, the voice of the people, speaking truths that no one else dared to utter. But this fame came with a heavy price. To the church, she was a manifestation of the demonic. To the state, she was a catalyst for unrest. As the Reformation began to tear England apart, Mother Shipton found herself in a landscape where every word she spoke could be interpreted as a spark in a powder keg. She was no longer just observing the world from a distance. She had become a player in a game of cosmic stakes, where the shadows of her cave were now stretching out to touch the very throne of England itself. Her life in these years was a masterclass in survival through mystique. She understood that her power lay in her perceived connection to a force older than the crown and more ancient than the cross. She leaned into the archetype of the Sibyl, the one who stands between the worlds. While the world around her was being dismantled by the whims of a king seeking an annulment and a new religion, Mother Shipton remained a constant, an unmovable stone in the shifting river of British history. The transition from oral tradition to the permanence of the written word is where the ghost of Ursula Southeil truly began to haunt the British consciousness. For 80 years following her death in 1561, Mother Shipton existed only as a whisper in the kitchens of Yorkshire and the taverns of London, a folk memory of a deformed woman who saw too much. But in 1641, the silence was broken. England was a pressure cooker of religious radicalism and political fracture, standing on the precipice of a bloody civil war between King Charles I and Parliament. In this atmosphere of existential dread, the public hungered for certainty, for a sign that the chaos was predestined. This was the year the first known pamphlet of her visions was published, the Prophecies of Mother Shipton. This was not a scholarly volume but a cheap, mass-produced chapbook. Yet, its impact was seismic. It introduced the world to a series of verses that would become the backbone of English prophetic folklore. Unlike the cryptic, celestial quatrains of Nostradamus, Shipton's prophecies were earthy, rhythmic, and terrifyingly specific to the English landscape. She didn't speak of cosmic alignments. She spoke of the fate of London, the destiny of the monarchy, and the very soil beneath the people's feet. These verses were not just predictions. They were psychological anchors in a world that felt like it was drifting into the abyss. One of the most chilling entries in these early records concerned the fate of the capital itself. The verse was simple: London shall be destroyed by fire in 66. To the readers of 1641, 66 was a distant, abstract number. But 25 years later, in September 1666, the abstraction became a literal furnace. As the Great Fire of London consumed the timber-framed heart of the city, the name of Mother Shipton was on every tongue. Even Samuel Pepys, the meticulous chronicler of the era, noted in his diary the eerie realization that the catastrophe had been foretold long before the first spark flew at the bakery in Pudding Lane. The prophecy had bypassed the skepticism of the Enlightenment. It had become a historical fact etched into the ashes of the city. But the reach of her vision supposedly extended even further back to the era of the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I. It is claimed she foresaw the coming of the Spanish Armada in 1588, describing wooden horses that would carry the threat of the Inquisition to the English Channel. She spoke of a great storm that would do the work of the English Navy, a Protestant wind that would scatter the invaders. While the skeptics point out that these verses only appeared in print decades after the events, the sociological impact remains unchanged. The English people had adopted Mother Shipton as their national Sibyl. In a time of national crisis, her prophecies provided a narrative of divine protection and inevitable destiny. She was the voice that told them that no matter how dark the storm, the outcome was already written in the limestone of her Yorkshire cave. This 1641 publication marked a turning point in how prophecy functioned as political currency. During the Civil War, both the Royalists and the Roundheads attempted to claim Shipton's verses to justify their cause. Prophecy was no longer a spiritual curiosity. It was a weapon of statecraft. If Mother Shipton had foretold the fall of a king, then the rebellion was not a sin, but a fulfillment of ancient law. The Hag of the Nidd had been elevated from a local witch to a political architect. Her deformities were no longer seen as a mark of the devil, but as the physical cost of carrying the heavy burden of the future. She was the unblinking eye of England, watching the gears of history turn from her grave. However, we must look closer at the nature of these verses. They were designed to be malleable, a characteristic of all great oracles. They used common imagery: water, fire, lions, and crowns, that could be retrofitted to suit the crisis of the day. Yet, there is a recurring theme in the 1641 text that is harder to dismiss: a profound sense of the unnatural. She spoke of men who would behave like beasts, and of a time when the seasons would lose their way. This was a reflection of the Tudor and Stuart fear of social inversion, the idea that the world could be turned upside down. In Shipton's mouth, this social anxiety was transformed into a cosmic law. As we examine the original 1641 text, we find a woman who was intimately connected to the volatile nature of her land. She understood the fragility of the peace and the precariousness of power. Whether these verses were her actual words preserved through an impeccable oral chain, or the clever fabrications of a 17th century editor seeking to profit from the panic of a nation, the result was the same. Mother Shipton became immortal. She had successfully migrated from the oral tradition of the folk to the printed reality of the historian. But as her fame grew, so did the temptations for others to speak in her name. The figure we recognize today, the woman who predicted the internet and the end of the world, is a shadow cast much later, a product of Victorian opportunism that nearly buried the real Ursula Southeil under a mountain of profitable lies. To find the real Mother Shipton, we must separate the 17th century oracle from the 19th century fraud. The immortality of a prophet is often maintained not by the accuracy of their words, but by the hunger of those who come after them. By the mid-19th century, the original, jagged image of the Tudor witch, the woman born in a limestone cave amidst the sulphurous mists of Yorkshire, had begun to fade, replaced by a version more palatable to the Victorian palate. The 1800s were an era of unprecedented transition. The Industrial Revolution was tearing the old world apart, and the steam engine was replacing the horse. In this period of dizzying change, the public sought a bridge between their ancient superstitions and their new mechanical reality. They found that bridge in 19,862 through the hands of a Brighton bookseller named Charles Hindley. Hindley was an opportunist, a man who understood the lucrative intersection of folklore and fear. He published a new edition of Mother Shipton's Prophecies, claiming to have found a long-lost manuscript that contained verses never before seen by the public. These verses were startlingly modern, written in a rhythmic, accessible style that stood in stark contrast to the dense cryptic couplets of 1641. This new Shipton didn't just talk about the fall of cardinals or the fire of London. She predicted the telegraph, the steamship, the automobile, and even the ironclad vessels of the modern navy. "Carriages without horses shall go," the verse claimed, "and accidents fill the world with woe. Around the world thoughts shall fly in the twinkling of an eye. Under water men shall walk, shall ride, shall sleep, and even talk." To the Victorian reader, this was a revelation. It suggested that their technological marvels were not just the result of human ingenuity, but the fulfillment of a 500-year-old divine plan. Hindley had effectively modernized the myth of Ursula Southeil, turning a Tudor outcast into a steampunk oracle. But the most dangerous addition to this forged canon was a specific date for the apocalypse. "The world to an end shall come in 1881. Today, we look back at such a prediction with the clarity of hindsight. But in the late 1870s, as the dreaded year approached, the panic was tangible. In rural England, families reportedly abandoned their homes, moving into the fields or the hills to avoid being crushed by falling masonry when the end arrived. The legacy of a 15th-century woman, distorted by a 19th-century fraud, was causing a 19th-century hysteria. It was only when the pressure of public scrutiny and the looming deadline of 1881 became too great that Hindley's Tower of Cards began to collapse. In 1873, writing in the journal Notes and Queries, Charles Hindley finally made a startling confession. He had fabricated the modern verses in their entirety. He admitted that there was no lost manuscript, no secret oral tradition. He had simply sat down and written what he thought a Victorian Shipton should have said to sell books. He had played the part of the prophet, using the name of an ancient woman as a mask for his own cleverness. Yet, a peculiar phenomenon occurred, one that defines the nature of belief. Despite Hindley's public confession, the damage was irreversible. The lie had become more famous than the truth. Even after 1881 passed and the world remained intact, people continued to quote Hindley's verses as if they were the genuine words of the cave dweller of Knaresborough. This is the central tragedy of Mother Shipton's archive. The Victorian forgery was so successful, so perfectly tailored to the anxieties of the modern age, that it effectively buried the genuine Tudor folklore. When most people today search for Mother Shipton, they are not finding the woman who defied Cardinal Wolsey or the child born in a petrifying well. They are finding the echoes of Charles Hindley's Brighton bookshop. The forgery gave her a global reach she never had in life, but it stripped away her authentic voice. We are left with a palimpsest, a story written over another story, where the original ink has been scrubbed away to make room for a more profitable narrative. To understand the real Ursula Southeil, we must engage in a form of spiritual archaeology. We have to peel away the iron ships and the flying thoughts of the 1800s to find the woman who actually navigated the treacherous waters of the Henrician Reformation. We have to ask why we, as a species, are so willing to believe a beautiful lie over a complex, dusty truth. Hindley's forgery worked because it offered us a sense of destiny. It suggested that someone, somewhere, knew exactly where our machines and our hubris were taking us. But the real Mother Shipton is far more unsettling. She represents the raw, unfiltered voice of the excluded, the person who sees the decay of society because they are not allowed to be a part of it. As we move into the final analysis of her legacy, we find that the most profound prophecies are not about the technology we build, but about the nature of the human spirit when it is pushed to the absolute edge of existence. The legacy of Mother Shipton does not reside in the pages of books or the pixels of a screen, but in the very stone of Yorkshire. If you travel to Knaresborough today, you will find the oldest recorded tourist attraction in England, a site that has been operational since 1630. There, the cave remains a damp, hollowed-out skull of the earth where Ursula Southeil supposedly first drew breath. But it is the adjacent Petrifying Well that serves as the ultimate metaphor for her myth. For centuries, visitors have hung everyday objects, teddy bears, hats, gloves under the mineral-rich flow, watching as they are slowly encased in a hard shell of calcified rock. The myth of Mother Shipton has undergone a similar process. A simple human story of a Tudor outcast has been suspended under the relentless drip of time, folklore, and forgery, until it has become something impenetrable, cold, and permanent. In the final analysis, Ursula Southeil represents the archetype of the liminal being, the person who exists on the threshold between worlds. She was born at the end of the Middle Ages and lived through the birth of the modern English state. She was a woman in a world of men, a pagan echo in a shifting Christian landscape. and a monster in a society obsessed with divine symmetry. Her power didn't come from a crystal ball or a pact with the demonic. It came from the clarity of the excluded. When you are pushed to the edges of the village, when you are forced to live in the damp silence of a cave, you begin to see the patterns that those in the warmth of the hearth are too comfortable to notice. You see the rot in the castle walls and the cracks in the cathedral's foundation long before the collapse begins. We must ask ourselves why we still listen to her voice 5 centuries later. It is because the human psyche has a fundamental, desperate need for the oracle. We live in a world defined by chaos, by the terrifying realization that history is often a series of accidents and blind impulses. The figure of Mother Shipton offers the seductive comfort of the predestined. If she foresaw the fire of 1666, or even the digital age regardless of the historical veracity of those claims, it implies that there is a script. It suggests that even the most horrific catastrophes are part of a larger, coherent narrative. We would rather be victims of a preordained fate than survivors of a meaningless coincidence. Mother Shipton's cave is a monument to this need. It reminds us that our ancestors were just as frightened of the future as we are today. They sought out the Hag of the Nidd for the same reason we look to data models and geopolitical forecasts. We want someone to tell us that they have seen the end, and that we might find a way to navigate the storm. The tragedy, of course, is that the real Ursula Southeil was likely far more interesting than the caricature of the witch we have been sold. She was a woman who survived the brutal machinery of the Tudor era through sheer force of will and intellect. She turned her isolation into an armor and her deformity into an altar of authority. As we close this investigation, we are left with a choice. We can choose to believe the Victorian steampunk fantasy of the woman who saw iron ships and flying men, or we can choose to honor the Tudor woman who looked at the most powerful men in England and told them that their time was a mere shadow. One is a profitable lie, the other is a blasphemous truth. The Mother of Shadows remains in her cave, her eyes fixed on a horizon we haven't reached yet, her voice echoing in the rhythmic drip of the mineral water, turning our present into the stone of the future. The archive remains open, but the silence of the cave is heavy. History is the ghost that refuses to rest, and we are merely the witnesses to its haunting. I am Krista, the Chronicler. Until next time, keep blasphemous, folks.